And these are beings who are interested in the evolutionary process and are involved with affairs on Earth, but never have been embodied. Right? There are other kinds of beings. And the angels are the ones who are interested in achieving the infinite through surrendering to the divine. And the bad guys, or the demons, are the ones who want to achieve the infinite by multiplying some kind of finite quantity. Right? So the demons want to reach God by becoming infinitely powerful or satisfying infinite lust. Right? And so there's kind of this false infinite that they're involved in. And they do in fact become highly involved in the physical world. So I would suggest to you that if I were a demon and I wanted to take on a body in the physical world, a corporation would be just the thing. But I want to be technical about this, right? If you look at the charter of a corporation, the mission of a corporation is to accumulate infinite money, right? To make as much profit as possible. That's a demonic or an asuric motive. And there's no reason that these beings couldn't be inhabiting these corporate structures, right? And then by their causal impact, right, they can be changing the values of the people who live and work in those organizations, so that those people tend to become sociopathic. And as we all know, corporations breed for sociopathy. The higher up you get in a corporation, the more sociopathic the people are, right? So I think it's plausible to say that part of what's going on the planet is what the Indians would call an asuric infestation, right? That these evil beings are coming down to the planet. Why? Partly because we haven't got our ancestors up there protecting us, because we don't pay any attention to them, right? So this is some of the things that we can think about. This gives us a way of understanding haunting, right? Oh, by the way, also haunting is one thing, right? So haunting, some transphysical being somehow affiliates itself with a certain region of the physical world, right? Comes right in here, and it gets stuck in a house or a particular geographical feature, and it keeps paying attention to that particular part of the physical world. There's a practice called telistike, which was a Neoplatonic practice in which people would meditate on statues until those statues would come alive. Right? So there's some way of bringing in a disembodied being, getting it to haunt a statue. That's a spiritual practice. Possession of all different kinds. Right? We all know about possession phenomena, but there are also very subtle possession phenomena that we don't really notice. So, we all have a lot of different voices in our heads. And sometimes there's a negative voice in our head or a very positive voice in our head that sort of comes in and keeps bothering us. That could be a subtle form of possession, right? There could be one of these transphysical beings that's getting involved with our personality. We'll talk about this more tomorrow, right? And actually showing up in life through us. Michael Murphy had an experience that he likes to talk about in which he was actually visited by a succubus, by an erotic angel that manifested in his life for a few weeks. It was very traumatic, a very powerful experience for him. The other people couldn't see it, right? And so we could say that one of these subtle world beings, a succubus, got involved in his personality and then began having synchronistic effects all around him through his personality. Channeling, of course, claims to be communication from disembodied beings, as does, the kind of work done by mediums. And it's very probable that UFOs are transphysical beings of some kind that are able to manifest certain subtle physical effects, like crop circles, for example, or some of the physical evidence that shows up in cases of UFO abduction. There's never enough physical evidence to say, oh yeah, some being came from another star, but there's always too much evidence to dismiss. Burned areas, strange radioactivity, and things like that, right? And so it appears that there's a whole transphysical menagerie that actually inhabits the Earth, because these same beings that people are now reporting who are abducting them can be found in Vedic texts thousands of years old. Right? And so when we begin to look at the transphysical worlds, we begin to have a way of explaining a lot of things, right? Including, in particular, life after death. I want to also make a remark about synchronicity. You know, as we know, synchronicity is defined as a meaningful coincidence, which is a pretty interesting definition because meaningfulness is so subjective. What is a meaningful coincidence? It's occurred to me that one way of explaining synchronicity, or maybe not all of synchronicity, but at least a very large class of synchronicities, is to see synchronicity as the influence of disembodied beings. Actually, we can see, I mean, obviously it's also the influence of embodied beings, because if it is in fact the case that we can influence the aims of the actual occasions in our environment, then we can have causal effects that are not mediated by the human body. So one of the most famous synchronicities of modern times is a synchronicity that happened to Carl Jung, where he's working with a patient, and the patient brings in a dream about a beetle, scarab beetle, and there's this knocking on the window, and Jung goes over and opens the window, and in flies a scarab beetle. This cured his patient and just, freed his patient from an overly restrictive notion of rationality. It's a big event, right? How does that happen? Right? So we can imagine that there was a connection between the psyche of Jung and the psyche of the client and the psyche of this bug, of this beetle, right? And that in some way they attracted the beetle to come. So it's not just acausal. It's not acausal at all. It's rather causes mediated through the transphysical worlds. That makes sense? I think a lot of synchronicities can be explained that way. And it's also the case that disembodied beings can bring about radical synchronicities. They seem to have more power to do that. So when Michael Murphy talks about this, this possession he had, his brief experience with the succubus, he talks about how he was in the middle of all this stuff, all these strange things were happening. Suddenly the telephone rings, and it's someone he knows in Germany who's calling him about something which is somehow relevant. I forget the details. Now, that would be interesting enough, but it was 3 a.m. in Germany. And the guy who had called Michael woke up out of a deep sleep at 3 a.m. and suddenly called Michael Murphy. And Michael said, "Why are you calling me at 3 a.m.? He said, I don't know. Right? That's an incredible synchronicity, right? And it seems like this being that was living in Michael's psyche and influencing the world through him had a direct telepathic communication with this guy in Germany and got the guy to call at that moment because it meant something to Michael and to this being. Right? So what I'm suggesting is that a lot of what we call synchronicity may be explained by transphysical causal interactions. And this might give us a handle. It's not just an acausal connecting principle. It's rather a connecting principle which is pointing to causes of a different order that are not mediated through the physical. Okay. So we can not only explain self-organization and evolutionary emergence and life after death, we can even explain synchronicity. You see, we're really getting somewhere here. All right, so to summarize all this, we have now described the basic metaphysical situation, reality itself, as always involving necessarily a halo of consciousness. There is no actuality that is not involved with consciousness. There's no space and there's no time that is not intrinsically associated with consciousness. That actuality is not just so, but every actual world implies a structured set of possibilities that are opening up beyond it. There is always possibility inherent in actuality. And every moment of actualization is a quantum of freedom, actual freedom, which is not determined by anything else. But real freedom is always conditioned by an aim or a goal or a purpose. And therefore, actuality requires consciousness, freedom, and purpose, or it isn't actual at all. Right? Actuality is not just vacuous or simple. The fundamental elements of actuality are not necessarily simple. This philosophy is not an example of what Stephen Browdy calls smallism. It doesn't say only little things are real, because actuality is actual occasions, and actual occasions consist of various grades. There are various grades of actual occasion, some of which are more complex and some of which are less complex. And more complex actual occasions can embody themselves in systems of lower grade actualities. But transphysical entities do not have to be physically embodied. Right? They can exist on their own. Now, there's one last thing I want to say, which responds to a question that I guess Aaron asked yesterday about what creates these higher grade actual occasions. How do they come into being? Right? What are the conditions under which they can arise? So remember that every actuality involves a real world in which it is coming to be, and it involves an aim. I want to just focus on those two features of an actual occasion. What Whitehead says is that if the actual world of an occasion is very simple, then that occasion will be a low-grade actual occasion. It doesn't have anything to work with, and so it's just going to pull together some abstract picture and expire. But if the world is more complex and more rich and more interesting, then if there's an aim at deep satisfaction, a high-grade occasion will come into being. It needs the aim for this reason. Let's say that I'm a high-grade actual occasion, and I come into being and I see the world in the rich way that I do. Right? But an electron might come into being right next to me, but it wouldn't see the world in that way. It needs both a rich world and a deep aim to create a high-grade actual occasion. Now, in the evolutionary advance, in the world that we're living in our cosmic epoch, it begins with a world that's all low-grade occasions.